Okay, so that does all the announcements. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Joe, who's going to talk to us about FFmpeg capturing live video and audio in FileMaker. So I'm super excited to hear what Joe's going to say, and I'm going to stop screen sharing and pass it over to him.
All right. Hey, everybody. I'm Joe with Portage Bay. I'm going to set up my screen share real quick. Okay, so I did an integration. We had a client who the solution called for controlling of some like security cameras. And then what we needed to do is grab files off of the cameras and do a bunch of video manipulation and audio work to kind of create the seamless experience between multiple cameras. So um, the majority of this demo is just focusing on the work we did with the file manipulation and then a little bit of work on capturing live feeds. Couple things to note is FileMaker by default does not handle RTSP, and RTSP is a pretty popular streaming platform, product, service, whatever you want to call it. It's used in a number of, especially cameras, but also sites can stream, video and, things like Netflix and stuff. They use a lot of RTSP in their streaming. And so we're using FFmpeg as kind of the middleman to generate, tell it where to get the feed and then pass that off to the command line tool, which is what we're using to control FFmpeg. And FFmpeg is just if you think about it, it's just a library. So it exists in a folder, just like any plugin. You call it just like you would in any command line environment. And inside that executable is all the tools necessary for what you want to accomplish. I have a long history with audio and music production. And so I was able to use some of that experience to kind of get my head wrapped around, managing audio and video and file manipulation. But there was a lot of information that I had to do research on, like what transcoding means and had to get file types and how to, support different codecs and all sorts of stuff that I had no idea about going into the project. Fortunately for me, I have an old friend of mine who is a digital archivist, and so I sat down with him with over dinner, and he just gave me a crash course on what all this stuff means. So it was very helpful in getting me up and running. Uh, but at the same time, figuring out how to make all those calls was just a lot of learning, searching, as we do as developers. I will say the FFmpeg documentation is extremely thorough. It's been in use for, geez, at this point, I think 15 to 20 years. It's used by all the big video, outlets, YouTube, Netflix, S3. I mean, they're all using FFmpeg libraries to manipulate video and audio and doing all sorts of codec, transfers and things like that. So, okay, here's the demo. So we're gonna jump into it. The first thing when you're dealing with, if you think of FFmpeg as a plugin, you got to deal with where it's going to be stored, how it's installed on the user's machine, and then how you're going to make calls to it. So in this instance, there are a few different ways FFmpeg can be used. It can be used in a Java as a Java library, so you can call it in JavaScript and then perform all the functions from there. In this scenario, we are using the command line to generate, we're using FileMaker to generate the command strings that will be used, and then passing that off to a command line tool, terminal, or, the command tool on Windows, and is also Linux compatible. But then we're just telling the command line to perform the task with all of the options embedded in a single string. So I'm not going to dive too much into, the the nitty-gritty of FFmpeg as far as defining codecs, and you can define all sorts of video parameters like resolutions and frames, and you can manipulate the video itself if you want to change your hue or actual output of the file that's being manipulated, and there was all sorts of stuff. But what we're really focusing on is how we've integrated into a FileMaker solution, and then how we're making sure that it runs smoothly between the two environments, or really three environments, but you're interacting with FileMaker and the command line the most. In the demo, I'm keeping everything pretty verbose, so you'll see the terminal window pop up, and I have it running all the functions it needs to. But in the live solution, I'm hiding the terminal, so the users never see that process. And it's a pretty, I wouldn't say seamless, but it works well enough that you never really notice that it's there unless you notice it in your taskbar. Okay, so a little bit about FFmpeg, and I will at some point. I'd like to make this demo available so everybody can kind of play around with it. It's pretty short and sweet, but it has all the primary functions that will get you up and running. So as I said before, if you think of FFmpeg as a plugin, well, that's a tongue twister. FFmpeg as a plugin, we have to think about installing it on startup. So if I go into the scripts, what I'm really doing here is just like there's documentation on installing plugins that FileMaker, like white pages that FileMaker has released. And that's really helpful. So we've wrote a set of functions that basically follow the same procedure. We have a plugins table. We're checking every record in that table. Let's see if I can find a set of scripts. And we're just iterating through every record with whatever information that we're, like the operating system, and checking for updates. If we iterate this version number, it'll install the newest version. If the user's machine has a different version installed, and things like that. So pretty basic as far as setting up FFmpeg to use on a local client's machine. This also can be done server side, so you could have a server with FFmpeg installed. You'd really have to do a lot more, protecting of your environment and scripts to make sure that it returns everything correctly. And then, of course, you're dealing with files. So if those files are living, on a shared drive, or, just stuff like that, you really have to think about. But for this demo, everything's local. Everything's being saved to a folder on my desktop. So we're not worrying too much about network drives or, crazy file paths. So once on the startup script, there's a script that just checks, a subscript that checks to see if FFmpeg is installed. And all we're really doing is seeing if it's installed in a specific folder, and then we're calling FFmpeg to return a version number. And that's pretty straightforward. There's nothing like since FileMaker can't tell if it's installed, natively like a plugin. You just have to call this command line in FFmpeg to get that version number. The hardest thing in my experience from using FFmpeg or any external tool that's not a plugin is you have to really define your file paths. Each operating system has a different way of accepting strings as or accepting a string as a file path. So you really have to think about how you're gonna format it with the quotes and escapes in the correct area. And each Windows and Mac have their own kind of pros and cons. I found that on a Mac, it's mostly easier, but there are still certain scenarios that you have to wrap certain strings in the FFmpeg call into quotes. So you have to really think about that when you're building your file lists and things like that. In Windows, it's a little bit easier, but not by much. I would say there are they're really good tools. Ever since FileMaker released the convert from FileMaker path and convert to FileMaker path, that helps like significantly. But at the same time, you really have to think about where your quotes are placed inside a string before you send it off to the command line. So with that said, it's a simple string we're just getting the path of the folder that FFmpeg exists in, and then we're calling that executable. And then we're also using another tool inside the library called FFplay, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So once you have your paths defined and your string set up, your command is just a version. So it's like I compare it to like curl options, where you're defining a function inside of the executable, and then what I'm doing, and there are a few different ways that you could grab the result. What I'm doing is telling FFmpeg to create a log with that output, a log file. It's just a text file. And then further down in the script, we're reading the contents of that text file to get the result of whatever executable. So I found that's a really easy way to handle that. I'd like to hear of other options if anybody has ever done integrations for this sort of thing where you're having to check an external log or grab a response in a different way. So in this scenario, we're just doing something simple. If it returns a version, we know that FFmpeg is installed and verified. And if it can't return a version, then we're exiting, and all other functions will not be able to perform because we're setting a global variable. So that's the installing FFmpeg and getting it set up for client use. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, we are using FFplay, which is a tool inside the library, and there are a number of, like I said before, there's a ton of different use case scenarios. But in this example, all we're going to be using it to do is stream RTSP audio. RTSP is a very specific, I would say, protocol. Most native OS like tool or audio players, like Apple Music and what's the Windows one? Windows Media Player, by default do not play RTSP. So I use VLC as my RTSP kind of testing tool. And so that allows me to verify if an RTSP is working correctly before I try to integrate it into the FileMaker solution. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any RTSP streams that were publicly available. So we'll just go through the process of showing you what it looks like, and then you can run with it if you do find one that is public. But all we're really doing is setting a URL. So let me open up my bugger. So this is the URL. This is the one I was trying to test with. There's a number of public ones that were live but not streaming audio. So couldn't actually give you a test that you could hear at least. But the command itself is pretty simple. So the string, that's the URL. It's the string, and we're basically calling the FFmpeg directory, and FFplay is the tool we're using. That's the executable. These are some parameters. So we're saying we're getting video is no, and then no display, because we don't want the user to actually have to see anything. And then the RTSP string. And all we're doing is sending that, or telling AppleScript, because we're on a Mac, to pass that over to terminal to perform that command string. So if you've ever done any work with AppleScripts, like, this is pretty straightforward stuff. But you do have to worry about file paths and things like that, or getting your quotes in the right place. But all it really does from this point is it will tell the terminal to activate and then fire off that command. So the audio playing in terminal, RTSP by default uses your default audio output. So there's no real configuration you need to do with it. So it's pretty straightforward. At that point, you're just going to have audio playing. So in the production solution that we wrote, terminal hides at this point, and it's just playing, playing the audio in the background. Once the user moves on to the next part of the solution and wherever they need to do it in the workflow, it actually quits that serve or the task that's running in terminal. So it terminates it altogether. Now, here's the main part of kind of the solution was handling files, like file manipulation. So I downloaded, if anybody's done work with like, test video, things like that, there's a pretty common video that a lot of people use called the Black Bear. And it's just this, I don't know when it was created, but I've seen it. The first I saw it was maybe 10 years ago when I was doing some work in a completely, different scenario, and people have been still using that same video. So it's kind of surprising to see it still around. But I downloaded an MKV, which is a Matroska file, and it's a file type I'd say it's still pretty common. I wouldn't say it's widely used, but generally MP4 is kind of your go-to video file. So what we're gonna do in the demo is convert it to MP4, and that's a pretty. Maybe up the debugger a little bit, run that off. I'm not going to go through every major thing, but as you can see here in the first part, I had to take a lot of time to define file paths. So because we're working in so many different environments, really between the OS, FileMaker, and then terminal, and then also AppleScript, you kind of have to really define multiple file paths of the same thing, just in different ways. So I've got the OS level file path that's what the terminal will use to read those paths, and then the FileMaker file paths, which are just different enough that you can't use them together or synonymously. So then we're getting the output paths. And then of course, I'm putting the result of that process into a text file to log it. And then there's some further, setting up file paths for the log. So the brunt of it is in this command string. So we'll skip down to that. And as you can see, this string is pretty straightforward. We're outputting the progress of it into this text file. And then we're saying the input is the MKV file here. And then we want to copy it. And there are multiple ways we can convert that file. Since I want to keep the original and I want to keep everything as is, we're not changing frame rates, we're not changing resolution, we're not changing there's all sorts of stuff. You could have audio only go from stereo to mono. You can convert or you can make all sorts of different changes in that file during the conversion. But all we're doing is copying it and exporting it out as an MP4. There, we've got our converted file into an MP4, putting it into a container. And actually, can you hear audio? I don't know if it's coming over.
Yeah, I can hear it a little bit.
Okay. So when that worked, it converted the the Matroska file, and now it's a more usable state. I'll show a little bit about one of the things we wanted to do in this solution was to merge multiple videos into kind of a grid. So like if you think about security systems, security, like in the monitor will have, however many screens all showing at once in kind of a grid setup. So we wanted to do something similar with these videos, but patch multiple videos together into to look like that grid. So, okay, it's all correct. Oh, like that. That's true.
Joe, there's a question that says, I must have missed how you're displaying the result of the command line in a web viewer.
We're not displaying it in a web viewer. This is just a standard FileMaker container. It's an interactive container here. So there's no use of web viewers to actually to grab any of the video or audio. In the solution, we are using it to display like live feeds and then RTSP feeds. But in this demo, we're just storing the result into a container. So there's no need for web viewers. Okay. Okay, so we're just getting a standard file list. So nothing crazy, just a quoted, delimited, quoted value list. So each path is quoted. And then we'll see where that's, where I have to define the specific file paths where that really gets tricky later on. And then all we're going to do is iterate through each file and then tell FFmpeg to merge everything together. So that's the basis of what we're trying to do. Setting up paths like I did before, we're getting our output. The operating system has a different looking path than the FileMaker version of it. And then we're using that convert from FileMaker path pretty heavily in this solution just to get the paths all, all the forward slashes and backslashes in the right places. We're designating which audio to use. If you've got multiple files, they're all going to have specific audio. So you can tell FFmpeg to use audio from one or split them, or up until so and so time and second, use this audio, and then from then on use the whatever audio of the different file. There's lots of options that you can really pass into it to manipulate these video files. Setting up our log path. And then I use a MBS plugin, which does a lot of formatting, like syntax formatting, which is really helpful when you're trying to debug scripts or just building them. It can tell you if you've spelled a variable wrong, things like that. So I always have a section in the script that clears or that defines certain variables as null before it continues on the rest of the script. So that way I don't have all these, result variables and such that that are highlighted red because they're not defined earlier in the script. So that's why that's there. Setting up our command string, and here is where it starts to get fun with these file paths. So as you can tell, all these command strings are quoted. So the path to FFmpeg, the path to each file that we're going to be using, and then the filter options that are getting passed into FFmpeg, those are quoted. And then we're mapping each video to a certain specific part of the grid. And then our output path. So when I mentioned the grid, the one thing that I'm doing here is kind of a cheat is I'm just duplicated the test video that I made, and I'm using that twice just to merge them together. In other scenarios where we've got multiple files with multiple resolutions and different frame rates, there are a whole subset of options that you're going to pass into the filter complex that will make everything this resolution, make all the frame rates the same, stuff like that. Where if you're dealing with multiple files, you really have to do some research on what your output is going to be. But since these videos are identical resolution and frame rate, we didn't have to worry too much about how we're going to stack them into a grid. So since they are the same, it's just going to put them together and not worry about any of the additional parameters. So we're basically just saying these are the inputs, 1 and 2, or well, 0 and 1. We're going to stack those, and there's all sorts of different variables for stacking and setting up the grid. So the documentation is pretty clear on a lot of that. And then we're telling it to map the top and then map the secondary, the second video. The S is just for confirmation. So we're just telling it to automatically to do it, because otherwise terminal will ask us if we really want to do it. And then here's our output. So pretty straightforward. This demo was set up to do 4 videos into one, but you can keep iterating through each one of those as you get into the more videos you've got, the harder this this calculation for defining the merge becomes. So just as an example, we'll look at that 4th one. So it's defined to set these up in a 2x2 grid. So you've got a lot more definitions for stack. The first row is going to be 0, 1, 1. Second stack is 2 and 3, and so on and so forth. You're getting a vertical stack, and then you're mapping the vertical, and then you're selecting which audio, since there's 4 different possible inputs. And then since this isn't a let statement, of course, it's just it takes some time to read. Even I don't like how I wrote this, because I would prefer more commenting. But then you're defining the actual string, which is the output, and then you're going to wrap that so it's inside. So it makes it easier for AppleScript to read. Okay, so we've run it, and as you can see in the terminal window, it's actually going through each frame and doing what it needs to do to merge those 2 files together. Let me see, it's a little bit more readable. Nope. Oh, so you've got some now it's finished. This gives us our results and everything that I had to do to that file to make it them merge together. And then what we've done is just told told FFmpeg to log everything that's significant. So any errors or or just the final result. So we're not creating log files with all this information. You can be very verbose in the logs, but all we're doing is just getting your basics. So now we're basically just stepping through. We're waiting for that log file to be readable, which it's not, because I was reading it while it was open. And all we're looking for in this scenario is there's a flag at the end of that file that says, actually, I can open up the log file. At the very end of it is the indicator that it was completed. There's a progress end, and that's all we're looking for. We're just looking for that pattern count. While it's going through its process, there's all sorts of progress continues. So I check that occasionally, and then you can kind of tell as you get familiar with it, each section that's logged looks about the same. So we'd be checking for errors in each of these sections. And the errors are pretty verbose, so it gives you a good indicator that something has gone wrong. And then you can choose to fail at that point, or trap, or whatever you want to do. And so since it's just a file that we're reading, a data file, we're opening the data file and then closing it. And then since I did it too early, it's not capturing my output correctly. But that's okay. And then once we know that it's completed, then all we're doing here is just handling the file. Let me go ahead and run it without the debugger on so you can see how fast it is. As you can tell in the command, since I'm on a Mac and I'm telling AppleScript to perform this command string, I really had to take some time to put in the quotes and the escapes on all the right places. But with the char function, it's a little bit easier to set up. So this, the backslash is with char 92 and quotes are 34. And so I'm explicitly using those as I'm building the string to set those in their correct places. So it does make it a little cumbersome, but with a little troubleshooting, it finally comes together. Pretty sure I did something wrong because it is completed, but it's still trying to read that data file. Yeah, we've got our output. So that's what it looks like. We just have two videos side by side. Okay. And I'd say that's the demo from there. I don't know if you want to do, start Q&A at this point.
Yeah, we can open it up.
I was going to add like the use for the client was multiple videos. So like you had the same video side by side, but they had 4 different videos side by side, in case people were wondering, why would you put 2 videos side by side?
Yeah.
They had multiple cameras feeding into the same display.
Exactly.
I have one question, Joe, too. In terms of extracting the video, was there an API for whatever recording equipment, or was it just a standard equipment? Is that why you chose to go with FFmpeg? Or kind of what went into that decision-making process?
The cameras were very specific in their file paths or file types. So they were designed around Matroska files. There wasn't really much else they had a very simple interface where you could do, very minimal things, but the client wanted to do a lot more that wanted to make it easy for the end user to just see a result. So FFmpeg, one, since it's free, it made it just a really easy option. There are some online API tools to be able to do this sort of converged stuff, but they also use FFmpeg. So we figured since we're going to be using, since the FFmpeg seemed to be the go-to tool, let's figure it out.
Interesting. Yeah. So you think this is pretty standard for any type of video recording software out there?
Yeah, from what I've been able to tell, FFmpeg is kind of the go-to. I mean, even one of the tools that I've used in the past is Handbrake, and even that used embedded FFmpeg commands.
So it sounds like the most difficult part was managing all the file paths. I know you kept mentioning that.
It really was. And there is, I actually wrote another blog about just handling file paths in FileMaker. So it was really helpful to use what I've learned from that into building this solution.
Yeah.
In the client solution that went to production, there's a lot of just URL. So you're passing files between servers and public URL destinations and grabbing grabbing video files off of each camera. And so just moving things around was really the hardest part of setting that, of getting file paths right. The FFmpeg documentation does make it pretty easy to at least understand how to make the calls. I'd say the hardest part about using FFmpeg is learning what all of the terms mean. So, learning what transcoding actually does, and, how to deal with different codecs, and what you need to do to a file in order for certain commands within FFmpeg to be able to read and manipulate it. So there's just a lot of overhead on the learning aspect of building solutions like this.
Were you running anything server side?
No, they initially the whole idea was they wanted to be able to set up kind of a secure video environment within minutes. So in some cases that would mean that the entire room was offline. So everything was built to run on a local client.
But would you have any problems running any of this server side?
I don't think so. Like I was saying before, I think there's a lot of just handling file paths. But because FileMaker can, or sorry, because FFmpeg can be installed like any other OS tool, command line tool, there are certain scenarios where it might actually be easier to run server side, because then you don't have to define the path to FFmpeg every time.
Right. Yeah, it's really awesome. Anybody else have any questions?